you have green microbangs and a septum ring and you're always boiling on the inside. Because you're in a basement and you don't eat enough red meat.
Scratch their heads, wondering what to make of it.
One, lazy. Two, the patriarchy.
I don't need to hear your story because I lived your story.
For the first 22 years of my life, I was always very pale. I couldn't tan whatsoever. Anytime I got a decent amount of sun exposure, rather than getting a nice little tan, my skin would burn, turn red, freckle, then go back to being pale again. I still remember the second-degree burns on my shoulders after a grade 5 pool party. Naturally, I was very fearful of these consequences, and I took great caution to avoid burning. I was active and outdoors a lot, so I'd put on SPF 110 up to 3 times a day. In the back of my mind, I always thought something was off with all this. What would people like me have done before the invention of sunscreen? Wouldn't they have been out in the sun way more than I am? Shouldn't sunshine be good for us, since we evolved with the sun shining down on us? Though I thought something must be wrong, I was in a world where some people just burn, and that's supposed to be totally normal. Nothing to think about, nothing to do with health, and certainly not diet related. To put a long story short, this all started to turn around when I drastically changed my diet. I don't recommend ever making drastic, sudden dietary changes, but one cool thing about large, sudden changes is that it can become very clear just how much that variable affects you in ways you never thought it could. Basically, I limited my diet to only red meat and salmon, and I cut out all vegetable oils. Again, I'm not recommending this at all. In fact, it ended up not being optimal for me because I seem to do better with some dairy and some carbs too. I'm a particularly sensitive individual, but this is just what works for me. Even though the purely carnivorous diet wasn't what I would settle on, I noticed a huge change with my skin. I didn't even realize until it changed, but my skin used to always be so dry and rough. About a month or two into eating loads of fatty red meat and fish, my skin was now buttery and smooth. This was in November of 2018. Fast forward many months through a Canadian winter, and that next summer was when I found out that my new skin no longer burnt in the sun. I had heard of this happening to other people who switched to a carnivorous diet, but I honestly couldn't believe it. I could spend all day in the summer sun with no sunscreen and my skin wouldn't burn. And this is coming from someone who used to burn super easily. If I got a ton of sun, my skin would go a bit red that evening, but it was absolutely nothing like the pain and inflammation I used to get. For a while, I couldn't believe it. I would catch myself worrying about being in the sun because I was so used to constantly hiding in the shade and covering up. Gradually, my relationship with the sun completely turned around. I loved what I once feared, and I sought that from which I once hid. I could go outside without worry and enjoy myself without having to slab on an embarrassingly thick layer of toxic cream. Sports, work, hikes, the beach, all way more enjoyable now that the sun was no longer my enemy. Now, I really felt like this alone was a miracle, but what if I told you that over the same period, especially as I started to tan, I felt a very positive shift in my mental health too. See, growing up, I always had a baseline level of anxiety that seemed to be constantly present. I felt consistently anxious, uneasy, not at peace, dissatisfied, and uncomfortable with myself. I often felt overly concerned about people watching and judging me, even if people obviously weren't, and even if there was no one around. When exploring outside, just going for walks, I frequently felt like something was going to jump out at me from the bushes. And you could see the anxiety in my posture. I would walk with my chest down and my shoulders rounded, really lacking any confidence. Now, it's only really in hindsight that I noticed these things as somewhat abnormal, because it wasn't until this time when my skin changed and I could tan that I had this sudden experience of being confident and comfortable with myself. It was only by contrast that I could see just how anxious I always used to be. All of a sudden, I felt like the anxiety inside me had been turned way down, and I could be more consistently at peace with myself. It might sound strange, but honestly, I think it was the first time I ever felt truly masculine too. Because in parallel with my feelings of anxiety and discomfort, I also felt anxiety and discomfort around my gender and sexuality. I sometimes wonder if I grew up maybe 10 years later than I did, would I perhaps have identified with the now more popular gender expressions such as non-binary? I'm not sure, but I was only happy to experience a change towards feeling masculine simply because it also came with a complete loss of the baseline anxiety I used to consistently feel. I now felt calm inside, confident, and sure of myself. Interestingly, there were more than a few other differences I felt change over this time. I also went from being a social justice warrior type person to adopting some somewhat more traditional values. I used to strongly feel that the world was a hopeless place, that humans were a cancer on the earth, and that society made people worse. I held a doom mentality on climate change, and I saw top-down authoritarian rule as the only way to fix what I thought of as an awful broken system. When I regained my health, however, my views seemed to drastically shift towards a more, you might say, libertarian outlook. I started to have confidence in humanity and hope for the future. I began holding the opinion that increasing individual freedoms was likely a better route towards progress, and that authoritarian rule to usher in the progressive changes I believed in would probably do more harm than good, no matter the goodness of the intentions behind them. For now, I'm largely going to refrain from casting judgment on these outlooks and viewing either one as better than the other, and I invite you to refrain from this judgment too. I just find this all really interesting, and I'm hoping to provide some sound explanations. Somewhat relatedly, I used to always like wearing loud clothes that were kind of alternative and different as a means of sticking out, but I really think this came mostly from a feeling of being dissatisfied with myself and compensating in a way. When I started to feel less anxious and more comfortable with myself, I slowly became more comfortable in dressing a bit more plainly. Again, I'm not judging one way or the other, I'm just making observations. Getting into more physical traits, I also used to bruise really easily. I've always been very active and I play a lot of sports, but whereas before I would have gotten bruises upon hard impacts, since I started to eat red meat every day, I honestly haven't seen a single bruise on my body. This might seem hard for some people to believe if you maybe bruise easily, but for example, just last week, I was hit square in the shoulder with a baseball pitch going at least 70 miles an hour, and I thought to myself, for sure this time I would get a bit of a bruise, but I didn't get anything, not a trace. Another thing is that between the ages of 15 and 20, I broke 3 bones on separate occasions, and they all broke surprisingly easily. Now, I know most of you might immediately think that this is unrelated and coincidental, but later on I'm going to explain just how important bile and good fat digestion is for the absorption of fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, and K, which are really crucial for bone strength. And I'll add that since my health transformation, I feel that I've experienced many situations with much greater impacts where I thought for sure I would have broken a bone, but I walked away just fine. It honestly just bewilders me how easily I used to bruise, break bones, and get injured compared to how it now seems almost impossible for me to get a bruise, break a bone, or succumb to any sort of tissue injury. Lastly, I always used to get 1, 2, sometimes 3 infections in a year, and I just always felt close to catching a cold. But since switching up my diet, I've had only 1 infection, which was a COVID infection, in the past 4 years. So my immune system feels a lot stronger, and even if people around me get sick, I pretty much never feel even close to getting sick. I should say that I really don't want to sound at all like I'm bragging in any way or that my health is perfect, because it certainly isn't. I'm continuously beyond grateful for the good health and well-being I've experienced, but what I'm getting at is that I simply wish to share that it is possible to experience drastic improvements in health. And I hope that people can develop a goal for themselves towards better health. I hope that from hearing my story, people can see that, hey, maybe I'm not stuck being pale, and maybe I don't have to be anxious for the rest of my life. Maybe there's something I can do about it. I don't have to bruise easily and get sick every winter. Maybe I can consider how the foods I'm eating do or don't nourish me with what I need. I say this because people rarely consider how diet affects them. To many people, everything that I've been talking about might seem completely unrelated, and some might think that diet and nutrition wouldn't have this much of an effect. But throughout this video, I'm going to explain why I believe diet and nutrition can completely change a person. How properly nourishing your body can not only make you stronger physically, but mentally too. This is a good time to say that I'd really love to hear your comments. If you've had a similar story where you've improved your health and you also see drastic improvements in not just your physical health, but your mental health, or maybe even just your general outlook on life, I'd really love to hear about that. I want to know what you did to do it and how things improved for you. With all this in mind, a reasonable criticism could be that I'm only one person. What might be true for me might not be true for anyone else. And this is a very valid point. At the time, I certainly didn't immediately jump to any conclusions that everyone would be like me and that all these traits are somehow connected to each other and to diet. Rather, I kind of picked up on the pattern I saw with myself and I kept it tucked away on file as something that could be interesting. What happened though is that I started to see the pattern all over the place. Through sharing what happened to me, I heard of loads of other people who had similar experiences where some of their most basic outlooks in life shifted after they upgraded their diet and their mental and physical health simultaneously improved in similar ways. At the same time, I also started to notice that every vegan social justice warrior type person was undeniably pale. I feel like I'm stereotyping, but am I? I started to wonder if, like me, they were also not well nourished and filled with anxiety, and that this was influencing them to view the world as a terrible place. Speaking of the world being a terrible place, remember COVID-19? So I'll be honest, with my now more libertarian attitude and resilience to infections, I was not a big fan of the lockdowns and the masks and the social distancing and the shots and the boosters and the boosters. But what can you do? Bored and lonely like so many other people, I found myself, unfortunately, getting back onto dating apps. Once I started using the apps, I further noticed that it seemed every transgender, non-binary, pansexual, and genderqueer person I saw had extremely pale skin with a noticeable lack of a rosy glow. To be blunt, they looked sick and malnourished. You know when you come down with a bad cold and people can see it because you look pale? That's kind of what I'm talking about. Sadly, they also often mention in their bio that they struggled with mental health and fatigue. Early on, I tried explaining the pattern I saw to friends, but some didn't believe me or understand what I was talking about. It seemed so obvious to me, and it frustrated me when I couldn't explain it well enough. So I began taking screenshots to provide at least some evidence for the pattern. As unscientific as this was, I wanted to make it somewhat scientific, so I resolved to simply screenshot a picture of any profile I came across where the person identified as trans, pan, non-binary, queer, etc. No matter what their skin looked like to me, whether they looked tan or pale to me, I would screenshot a photo. I selected one or more pictures from each profile where you could see their skin at least somewhat well without too much interference from makeup, filters, or lighting, and tried my best to choose the more decent photos, but they are from dating apps, so viewer discretion is advised. I'm fully aware that most people would consider this a very weird thing to do, and I myself also consider it very weird. I blacked out any personal information as well as their eyes to maintain their anonymity because I feel it is the right thing to do. One unfortunate consequence of blacking out their eyes is that on most faces you can't see the dark under eyes, a symptom of iron deficiency that I found so prominent amongst the pictures. However, with some pictures you're still able to see the dark under eyes to know what I'm talking about. Looking at the profiles, I would say that unfortunately not a single person I came across who identified in these ways appeared well nourished and healthy, nor did a single person have a tan or lively color to their skin. As informal as this process was, I believe that this is a significant result and warrants further investigation. If this wasn't a pattern, there would be at least a few who don't fit the pattern. Even if only half of the people in this sample size fit the pattern, that would still be significant. But it's not half, it's all. When I realized this, to both understand my own past with poor health and anxiety, and to understand anxiety and nutrition more in general, I began to start thinking and researching about exactly what nutrients might be at play in this pattern. Both from my everyday experiences and this sample of profiles, I noticed more than just an association with pale skin. I also noticed that there seems to be various other stereotypical traits, behaviors, and beliefs, many of which are the same or similar to what I described earlier with my past. I hesitate to stereotype, but there truly does seem to be a pattern here with what I will reluctantly call the SJW type for sake of ease, but please remember that this is only a pattern and that some people fit a pattern in some ways, but not others. As far as appearances go, we have pale skin without much of a lively color or rosy glow to it, bruising easily, sometimes dark under eyes, and fatigue. Being under or overweight is common, somewhat thin, weak hair, alternative haircuts with loud colors, and having many tattoos seems common as well. Immediately, we might notice that a lot of these traits are connected to iron deficiency. As far as personality and behavior goes, I find that many social justice warrior type people are vegan, vegetarian, or just eat little to no red meat. A wish to not have children, or even to somewhat misanthropically believe that having children is actually bad for the planet, seems to be common. I definitely notice a pattern around being alternative with spirituality, witchcraft, astrology, tarot cards, polyamory, being gender fluid, maybe being goth, etc. I don't think I've met anyone who is the social justice warrior type who isn't also anxious and maybe somewhat irritable, but more so anxious. And of course, somewhat by definition, the stereotype is around being very progressive and often with an authoritarian bent to it. Let's go over an outline for what we're going to talk about today in this video. First, I've already told you about the pattern I've noticed surrounding pale skin and poor mental health. I've shown you some picture evidence for this pattern, and I think you should be able to see what I'm talking about. Second, I'm going to explain my view on mental health and how I see it as largely a reflection of our physical health. Third, we're going to learn about cholesterol, a lot about cholesterol, particularly the problems associated with low cholesterol and how low cholesterol affects people not just physically but mentally too. We'll briefly go over a category of nutrients you might have never heard of called carotenoids, and how carotenoids in the skin, or a lack thereof, can be an indicator of health. We'll talk about the effects of the world's most common nutrient deficiency, iron deficiency, how iron is important for immune health, mental health, reproductive health, and giving you that rosy glow that people like. Lastly, we'll discuss endocrine disrupting chemicals, how they can affect our overall mental, physical, and reproductive health. And finally, we'll wrap things up with a conclusion. Here's some preambles I'd like to say, given the sensitivity of this topic. I personally am happy and supportive for people to live their lives however they see fit. All I care about and all I hope to ameliorate with this video is some needless suffering that comes with poor mental health and poor nutrition. I hope others take on this viewpoint, and I condemn anyone who harbors hatred for people simply for their differences. Relatedly, I'm not prescribing any forward action or calling for any public changes. I'm simply sharing my understanding in hopes that some people may gain new insights that will allow them to enact positive change in their own life. I believe it is up to the individual to decide what is best for themselves. Number 3, I found there to be a lack of science on associations between nutrition and gender dysphoria. The research I present is on anxiety and other indicators of health that I see as related to gender dysphoria. What I'm presenting is merely my own broad-ranging hypothesis. I base my hypothesis on my own experiences, knowledge of nutrition, and scientific evidence on surrounding matters. 4, when I refer to gender dysphoria, I'm referring to the anxiety related to feeling a mismatch around one's own gender and sex. I'm happy for anyone to present themselves as any gender they choose. What concerns me is the anxiety, the poor mental health, and the poor physical health that many people suffer with. And what concerns me most is that people who know better are choosing to ignore obvious signs of poor mental and physical health. That being said, I believe it is possible for someone to be transgender and not have any dysphoria about it. Since I'm discussing the anxiety that often accompanies a mismatch between biological sex and gender identity, I have chosen to use the term gender dysphoria because it would not be appropriate for me to clump in people who are transgender but don't have any anxiety or dysphoria around it. Number 5, throughout this article, I'm speaking about the pattern I see. And this pattern is along a spectrum. Many individuals may fit a pattern in some ways, but not others. Likewise, there are always exceptions to patterns, especially when it comes to humans who can be so diverse and complex. To summarize these preambles, let me put things another way. If someone whom I cared greatly for wished to start presenting themselves as a different gender and wanted me to refer to them by a different name, I would be perfectly happy for them. However, if they were also suffering with anxiety, depression, self-harm, suicide, if they were visibly malnourished and horribly pale, I would be concerned for them and believe it would be wrong of me to ignore these aspects simply to avoid appearing prejudiced towards their gender identity. I hope, therefore, that people will understand that this is not an attack on anyone. So to set the tone right, let me start by completely embarrassing myself. I am a 27-year-old man who only has like 6 chest hairs, and I would love a 7th. Okay, I also barely have any facial hair. While I wish I had at least some chest hair and could grow a beard, I'm pretty over it. Like, it's totally okay. It's nothing to be ashamed about. It's not really in my control anyway. That being said, if someone asked me if I thought that it was a sign of good health, I would say no. Rather, I think it's likely a sign of poor health, at least poor health at some point in my life, likely during puberty. Likewise, if the rate of men with little to no chest hair was steadily below 1% for centuries, but it jumped up to 5% in a matter of years, alongside a sharp increase in poor mental health, anxiety, and depression, I would have some questions regarding the health of that population. I wouldn't judge the individuals who were a part of this trend, but I would have some questions. If I made a change in my life that led to me growing chest hair and simultaneously was accompanied by multiple other improvements in my health without any negative consequences, I would think the change I made was a healthy one. The question is, should I then try to explain what led to the positive changes? Would people be curious?